I just want to start with something Madiba or Nelson Mandela said. He said a long time ago that our freedom as South Africans is incomplete without the freedom of the Palestinian people. And I think that statement is very, very meaningful for many of us who were born in South Africa, grew up under apartheid, and resisted this system of, as Elena showed you, systematic discrimination. In fact, apartheid was seen, Elena, the phrase that was used was separate but equal. Of course, the system of apartheid was not equal. There was differential allocation of resources to people according to the racial imagination of our rulers, from the cradle to the grave, whether it was education, recreation, healthcare. Every aspect of your life was determined by what our rulers considered which racial group you belonged to. When Elena was showing some of the slides, I thought back about my own life. Where I was born, the schools I went to, the issues of discrimination. And of course, when Alex and Andrea came to fetch me from the airport, I said, "What do you want me to talk about? I'm going to be in Italy for the next week, and I don't want to give the same speech every time. I've just come from Sardinia, and I thought I would like to talk about something that's different." And they said, "Please talk about apartheid, because for many of us, my generation and older, those who have gray hair like me, understand, because, you know, the apartheid system was in the news, people talked about it. For younger people, sometimes it's difficult because for some reason that has been erased, that history." They said, talk about apartheid, explain what it was like, but also talk about the university, the role of the academy in taking up social justice issues. And the issue of Palestine, I think, is emblematic of the time today. In the same way, the struggle against white minority regimes in Southern Africa, or the struggle of the Vietnamese people against American imperialism, or going back, further back in recent history, the struggle of the Spanish people against fascism, or even more recently against the dictatorships in South America. Those struggles galvanized humanity. They galvanized humanity. Some of the best aspects of being human came out. It was a question of taking principled stands. It was not a question of lucre or money or opportunism. And those qualities should be infused into our academies, our institutions of higher learning. There is a book, a thin book written by Edward Said called The Representations of the Intellectuals. And that particular booklet is very important because he distinguishes intellectuals from academics. He talks about intellectuals as people who speak truth to power, who are not seduced by money, being in prestigious committees, etc. People who take a principled stance. And over the past few years, I've had the privilege, I've always wanted to go to Antonio Gramsci's home village where he was born, because Gramsci has a lot to say about this as well. What it means to be an intellectual, what it means to be connected to social concerns and political concerns in the true definition of the term. So when Mandela said those words, he didn't say it because he said it for particular reasons. Because as South Africans, we understand what it means to be humiliated, discriminated against from the cradle to the grave, as I mentioned. And over the years, there is a strong feeling in our society. The grassroots understand why it is important to take a stand against what we call apartheid Israel. And some of the actions have been very important. A few weeks ago, the biggest university, the second biggest university in South Africa, the Tshwane University of Technology, decided that at the Senate level, the students as well as the academics, they voted to cut all ties with Israel. And this was because Israel came to the university and approached particular faculties. These were the natural sciences, to try and get cooperation with them on water technology. And of course, South Africa is a water-scarce country, so people are clearly interested in this. And this resulted in a lot of debate. And after a long process of debate, people made this decision. I will come to, at a later point in the talk, my own university, the University of Johannesburg, as Simona mentioned, and our decision to cut links with Israel. And I'll explain in a bit more detail. But I just want to give you the kind of understanding why we feel so strongly against the system of discrimination against the Palestinians. Some of the action involved many marches. In 2004, for example, we had one of the biggest marches in our country, about 200,000 people after the bombardment of Gaza. It was one of, it rivaled the march welcoming Nelson Mandela from prison after 27 years. It was that big. Other highlights of concrete actions of solidarity included tens of thousands of people in 2001 at the United Nations Conference Against Racism in the port city of, in the Indian Ocean of Durban, where people marched and proclaimed the second anti-apartheid movement. At the head of this march was some of the veterans of our struggle, people who spent a long time in prison, people who were tortured, people who were in exile, and they put themselves at the head of this march of trade unionists, student organizations, women's groups, faith-based groups. We also had an equally strong march at the World Summit on Sustainable Development in 2002. And that march focused on environmental issues and what Israel is doing in terms of the environment in Palestine as well, including issues of the land. Now, when Elena showed, I'm going to bring in some aspects of apartheid as I'm giving you these examples, when Elena showed you that map, the balkanized, the jigsaw map of South Africa with the Bantustans, it's not contiguous at all, as you saw. That 13% of the land was the least arable land set aside for black people, for indigenous people in our country. It's not different in Palestine. If you look at historic Palestine and what it looks like today, it's not different. You cannot have a viable sovereign state in that situation. This land is cut off by Jewish-only roads. It is the Group Areas Act writ large. Gaza and the West Bank is akin to the Bantustans that we had. Now, when you compare any two countries, you're not going to get the exact thing. So there are differences, some significant differences, but there is absolutely no doubt that Israel is an apartheid-like society. There are some essential differences which I will talk about. I want to give you one example. And this is how the Israeli regime has also learned from the apartheid regime in South Africa. There was a famous cabinet minister, Israeli, in the Knesset. Her surname was Shilumet. You can Google this as well as you're sitting there. Just type in "Is Israel apartheid?" And she said something very significant many years ago. In fact, the situation has gone worse after what she said. This isn't a Palestinian. This was an Israeli cabinet minister. She was driving on one of these Jewish-only roads, and a Palestinian family was in a car in front of her, and the soldiers stopped the car, and the soldier called them out and humiliated them, as is their wont. This is what they do all the time. This is what we were confronted with. 18, 19, 20-year-old young people behaving in a very insulting, rude, crude way towards people who could be their grandparents. This is what we witnessed in South Africa every day, and this is what Palestinians witness today. Some of us have seen this ourselves. Archbishop Desmond Tutu, who one can arguably call the moral conscience of the world, said that what he witnessed was even worse than what he witnessed in South Africa. Coming back to Shilumet, she confronted this soldier and she said, "What are you doing? Why are you doing this?" So he said, "No, Palestinians can come here. This is just for the Israeli settlers." So she says, "But what do you mean? There's no sign saying Jewish-only road like you had in South Africa, the petty apartheid that Elena talked about, whites only, non-whites only, toilets separated, etc., buses separated." So the soldier responded in a very significant way. He says, "Why? Do you want the people to call this apartheid? Because that's what they do if we put up the sign." So the effect and the impact of what Israel is doing is the same, but they might do it differently. I think this is very significant. And it's a very complex system of discrimination and separation. And there are numerous laws that are used to do this. I was talking about the actions of South Africans in support of Palestine, of the Palestinian people. And this is every aspect of society. Workers, professionals, academics, politicians, every sector of our society see an equivalent of their profession, whether they are lawyers or educators or teachers or students, being discriminated against in the same way we were discriminated against. So the workers, after Operation Cast-led assault on Gaza, the workers, the dock workers in South Africa, refused to offload the ships coming from Israel. And that was also very symbolic, because one of the first significant actions in terms of international solidarity in support of the South African people was the Liverpool dock workers and dock workers in Scandinavia as long ago as 1959, 1960, 1961. That is another significant thing. Many people think that we had this anti-apartheid movement, this boycott, divestment, sanctions campaign against apartheid South Africa overnight. People just saw the light. They saw the reasoned arguments, they were outraged, and they said, no, we must boycott this racist minority regime in South Africa. It did not happen that way. It was hard work, and it took a long, long time. The first call for boycotting apartheid South Africa started in 1959, and it took a few decades before it became meaningful and significant, before multinational organizations, the Olympics, the UN, governments started taking real concrete action. But initially, it was the work of people on the ground. It was groups like this, sometimes very small groups, who talked about the system, who talked about the need to stand in solidarity with South African people. Now, for more than 70 years, Palestinians have alerted us to one outrage after another. Injustices piled upon injustices without the commensurate scale of global solidarity that is required to prevent what Ilan Pape talks about, an incremental genocide. If you look at the map of historic Palestine and what is left, you will understand what I'm saying. If you understand that those 700,000 Palestinians that were forced to leave their homes in before 1948, and their descendants who now number 7 million around the world, you will understand that there is a genocide taking place, according to the UN definition. But worse, today in the mainstream of Israeli society, there are politicians who are openly talking about genocide. They are doing this as we gather here today. Some of the ministers have said we must finish 1948. This is what they say, and what they mean by that is quite clear. What you saw with Ahed Tamimi, 16 years old, the way her family have been harassed, the number of children arrested by Israel, all of us around the world know about this very brave Mala from Pakistan who was attacked by the Taliban. How many people? I don't think an equal number of people know about Ahed Tamimi. Mala correctly, rightfully, was showered with appearances at the United Nations, awards, prizes, etc. This is not happening to Ahed Tamimi. Doesn't she deserve that as well? You know, in South Africa, we had a campaign for the release of child detainees. Many of us were arrested. I was arrested when I was 16. My brother spent many years in prison, and there was a campaign, a global campaign, to free the children.